About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he couldn't find a scientific explanation for. So, with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now, this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
This is Noetic Moments, where we explore the field of research that discovers what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be very different if we understood it better. I'm Ruth Miller, a longtime student of consciousness studies, cybernetics, and anthropology, and through this series of programs I'm introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research, and I'm explaining some of their ideas and experiments so that we all can understand who and what we truly are capable of. I'll also explore some relevant news items and answer the questions that you send to my email address, ruth@noeticmoments.org. Now, in the world of medicine and psychology, consciousness is defined as being awake and aware, knowing what's going on around us. In the field of noetics, though, consciousness is much more. It's not only what we are aware of, but it is what's going on in the mind that we may not be aware of. It's also profound human experiences that shape our lives, and it's those ways of being that are connecting all of us. So far in this series, we've looked at a number of models of what consciousness is, starting with the first scientists trying to understand this thing that science had not been allowed to look at. Back at the early 20th century, over 100 years ago, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, who both made it quite clear that what's going on unconsciously may be driving most of what we're aware of. Over the next 40 years or so, people tried all kinds of understandings to make sense of both Jung and Freud's ideas and other ideas, including the behaviorists who were focusing on what we are aware of. Charles Tart in the 1960s introduced the concept of various states of consciousness in which we are aware of different things. And Julian Jaynes in the 70s related consciousness to the separation of the right and left hemispheres of our brain, each of which tends to focus on and work with different kinds of knowing. We then looked at some of the field models of mind that have been developed in order to explain how it is that mind affects and is affected by the body and other things around us faster than nerve signals can travel. So we looked at the work of Rupert Sheldrake, Kurt Levine, and several others, which brought up, of course, how quantum mechanics relates to consciousness, as described in the work of David Bohm, Dana Zohar, and Amit Goswami, and we will have some more input on that here coming up. We then looked at the idea of a field of consciousness that includes all of humanity, called by Peter Russell the global brain, Teilhard de Chardin called it the noosphere, and Ervin Laszlo called it the global mind, which led us into the field of transpersonal psychology, applying some of these understandings in therapy as well as research. Then we came back into the body and looked at the work of Candace Pert, who described how hormones generated in the brain act as molecules of emotion, affecting every aspect of the body, and Bruce Lipton, who showed how that worked and suggests that we are actually experiencing a biology based on our belief system, which is totally supported by the work of Carolyn Mace, who was working with that idea through the 80s and 90s. Increasingly, with the turn of this last century, we are looking at something called coherence. And this is a state of consciousness in which heart, mind, emotions, every aspect of the being and consciousness are all in alignment, which has some interesting results, some of which showed up in some of the experiments we looked at that supported telepathic communication between two people, experiments that involved mind affecting matter, and the experience of remote viewing, also called clairvoyance. Then we talked about those different states of consciousness that we do operate in every day, and we explored frequencies and how we can choose to move into higher and lower frequencies of vibration patterns in the brain and the heart. We used the work of Penny Pierce, the study of cymatics, and the water crystal experiments of Masaru Emoto and others to help us understand that. For a few episodes, we looked at the healing process and the role that consciousness and the vibratory patterns play in the body's response to threats and distress, which we're going to look at again from a new perspective here in the next few shows. But the last few shows, we've been looking at the brain, which is the bridge between mind and body, and which most materialist scientists think is the origin of our consciousness. You can catch up on those past shows on the KXCR.net archives. You want to click on the little cloud up on the banner at the top of the screen. And on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where you'll also find links to the books, the clips, and the authors that I mention and use on the show. Now, we've been talking about the brain for a couple of weeks now, and for most materialist scientists, as I've said, there's no difference between brain and mind. For them, the brain is the seat and source of all thoughts, memories, feelings, responses, reactions, in short, all consciousness. Fortunately for humanity, that belief system has led to some amazing technological discoveries about the brain that have been very useful in addressing traumas and certain forms of disease, and have helped us understand more fully the relationship between brain and mind. Equally fortunately for humanity, that belief system is by no means the only one being explored, and the emerging science of Noetics is one example of the other kinds of explorations. Why do I say fortunately? Well, if the idea that the brain is the source of all awareness, will, thought, memory, and imagination were the only form of study going on, then no one would be looking at the thousands of records we have of what's been called, quote, mental or, quote, spiritual or, quote, faith healings. They wouldn't explore the placebo effect, thinking about it as purely mechanical and chemical. But as we discussed last week, it is far more than that. If the belief that the brain is the only source of consciousness were the only basis for scientific inquiry, none of the quantum theorists could explore how it is that a subatomic unit seems to choose whether to show up as a particle or a wave depending on whether there is a conscious being observing, or how a close couple of people begin to think alike, or how certain psychiatric disorders are addressed without drugs and without behavioral therapy. So we are indeed fortunate that some people do not ignore their own experience in favor of the currently accepted scientific theory. Among those is a UCLA psychiatrist, Jeffrey Schwartz. As a practicing psychiatrist and author, he integrates the process of mindfulness with neuroplasticity. I'm going to let him tell you what it is that he is saying.
The brain puts out the call. We all acknowledge this. The brain is the passive part of existence. The brain puts things into our consciousness, but it is the active mind that makes choices about whether to listen and how to listen. And in the process of doing that, you rewire your brain. That is the big message. The brain is a very complicated thing, no question about it. In this picture on the bottom, you see the red OFC stands for orbital frontal cortex. Just adjacent to it is the purple amygdala, the fear and emotion circuit. We're going to be hearing more about these. These are the emotional part of the brain. Right above it, you see the red reward system. The VS stands for ventral striatum. This is the reward part of the brain. Dopamine is huge here, but right above it is the habit center of the brain. CD in blue stands for caudate. And the thing to note is that the reward center sits right embedded in the habit center. Both are run by dopamine. So dopamine definitely gives you pleasure. That's a fact. But in the process of doing it, it forms embedded habits. So we need to be careful about how we approach pleasure, what we do with pleasure, because anything that gets that reward pleasure center activated rapidly becomes a habit below consciousness that runs our lives without us realizing it. takes a lot of attention to get those things in balance, the relationship between pleasure, reward, and habit.
So clearly, for Dr. Schwartz, the mind guides the brain, and the brain affects the mind, but they are not the same thing. He goes on in his studies to help people figure out how to use mindfulness, to explore and explain what is the brain's activities and to modify the brain, as he uses the term neuroplasticity. Now, he's got 4 steps, he says, to help people rewire the brain.
The 4 steps is really good for everybody because it really is a form of applied mindfulness. So the 4 steps are getting you in touch with it by relabeling. It's getting you to reframe and see the cognitive errors when they occur. Take that into account, get the cognition clarified, focus your attention reflecting the true goal, which is the clarified cognition. When you do that regularly, you rewire your brain and you develop a value system that basically gets you automatically into a state of awareness.
So let me go over those 4 steps for us again. The first step, he says, is getting in touch with the deception by relabeling it, by reframing it is another way to talk about it. It's getting you to reframe the issue and see the cognitive errors that are built into it. Then taking that into account, he says, get the cognition clarified. That is, get what you are intending clear. Focus your attention on what you are intending, reflecting the true goal that you are aiming for. And then his third step has to do with the actual rewiring. As you're doing this, focusing your attention on the actual goal, you are shifting the brain, the neurons that wire together. That's called Hegg's law, H-E-G-G, Hegg's law, in case you're interested. So as you focus your attention on your intention rather than on the cognitive issues or the deceptions from the brain that have been programmed into the brain by previous habitual thought patterns, then you're entering into a new state of awareness. And that state of awareness leads into a new set of values that then realign future decisions in alignment with this original intention. So Jeffrey Schwartz, the psychiatrist, has been using functional magnetic resonance imagery to help people see this, another form of brain scan. We've talked about EEGs in the past, and functional magnetic resonance, functional MRIs, is another one. And you can see in his patients, as you go to the YouTubes that we've linked in the website, you can see how his patients are actually activating different parts of the brain that they haven't activated before. And they've deactivated parts of the brain that were running things before. And as he noted in the first clip that I played, the feeling good center and the habit forming center are literally right next to each other. So we want to make sure that what we are feeling good about is what we truly want to have habits about, not things that are ultimately getting in the way of our well-being. Now, Dr. Schwartz is doing this work over about 30 years now. His books came out in the early 2000s and are coming out again, and people are posting videos and so on. So you will see quite a bit of work by him out there if you are interested in following this up. And that actually brings me to the book review, which is his book, The Mind and the Brain. And the subtitle is Neuroplasticity and the Power of Mental Force. His co-author on this book is Sharon Begley, Begley. It's a Harper Perennial book, published in 2002. And this book has a marvelous, marvelous style. It's easy reading. It's autobiographical in many ways, good stories, good examples all the way through. And there's excellent endnotes and a good index. What I'd like to share with you is what he writes in the epilogue. He says, "It is telling that the decade of the brain, as the first President Bush designated the 1990s, had that name rather than the decade of the mind, for it was in the brain rather than the mind that the scientists and lay people alike sought answers, probing the folds and crevices of our gray matter for the roots of personality and temperament, mental illness and mood, sexual identity, and even a predilection for fine food. In my own profession," he says, "of neuropsychiatry, this attitude is encapsulated in the maxim, for every twisted thought, a twisted molecule," unquote. Any mood, preference, or behavior once ascribed to the way we were raised or even to freely willed volition instead came to be viewed as the child of our genes and our neurotransmitters, over which we had little, if any, control. He goes on to say, the brain, to be sure, is indeed the physical embodiment of the mind, the organ through which the mind finds expression and through which it acts in the world. And there he is making it very clear he's in total agreement with the work that we've been exploring here in the field of noetic sciences. He says, within the brain, ensembles of neurons represent the world beyond, recording both the perceptions of our five senses and the world of mind alone. Internally generated imagery produces no less real and measurable a neuronal activation than images of the outside world, but the brain, he says, is more than a reflection of our genes. He says, as we saw in Chapter 3, the paltry 35,000 or so genes in the human genome fail woefully short of the task of prescribing the wiring of our 100 trillion synapse brain. The brain is therefore shaped by and etched with the traces of our experiences, the barrage of sensory stimulation that our peripheral nerves pass along to our brain, the skills we acquire, the knowledge we store, the patterns our thoughts and attention make. All these, and much more, leave their mark. He goes on and talks about how different people have begun to see this and understand this. His epilogue is just beautiful. The willful focusing of attention is not only a psychological intervention, it is also a biological one. Through changes in the way we focus attention, we have the capacity to make choices about what mental direction we will take. More than that, we also change in scientifically demonstrable ways the systematic functioning of neural circuitry. Nowhere is this more clear than among patients with OCD, that's obsessive-compulsive disorder, who practice the mindfulness-based four-step therapy. By refocusing attention in a mindful fashion, patients change their neurochemistry. One more piece of the puzzle, one more perspective helping us understand that brain and mind are related, that our human experience of mind comes through the brain. Yes, but the brain is not the mind. Well, all right, that sound tells me it's time to answer a news question or answer a person's question, a question from one of you wonderful listeners. And one of you listeners actually saw me in person a few weeks back and asked me a question that I had forgotten needs to be answered. At the beginning of our show, each time I tell you that I have been studying consciousness and cybernetics and anthropology. But most of you have no idea what cybernetics is, and that's unfair of me. So let me explain. What is cybernetics, and how is it that I am a student of cybernetics? I came to study the field because I had studied anthropology, I had studied the environment, I had been working in the world of community development and environmental impact assessment, and I was seeing that we did not understand why and how human beings make such a mess of our environment. We did not understand how a high-tech culture like ours could have such a horrid score as far as maintaining the beauty of our natural world and the harmony of our relationship with the natural world. And as I was being aware of that, I encountered a college catalog. So when I looked at this catalog, I saw that the first 4 classes in this program they were considering were technology and society, future studies, and systems methodology. And I was going, ooh, this looks like it might be asking or addressing some of the questions I've been asking. So I talked with the director of the program, and it was like the end of August, middle of August one year, and he said, well, classes start next Monday. I'm going, what? I thought classes were going to start in September, maybe even October. He says, it's a little late, but tell me about yourselves. And my husband and I were both interested in this question and in the possibility of a new graduate program. And I told him about our background and what he had been doing and what I'd been doing. And he said, you're just the kind of student we're looking for. If you can be here for classes on Monday, I'll walk your application through. It took some doing, but we actually were there. We were able to arrive for classes on Monday night. We didn't have a babysitter, so I had a nursing baby in my arms, but they were willing to put up with that. The program was called Cybernetics Systems. It was at San Jose State University. And it was, in fact, the perfect place for me to go to begin to understand these issues. So that's how I came to study cybernetics. So what is cybernetics? The term is something that was derived from a Greek term, kybernetes or kybernetor, which became in Latin gubernator, and gubernator became an English governor. A thermostat or a speed governor, a speed control, cruise control, are all simple cybernetic systems. There is a single feedback loop. The man who invented the term was a mathematician who had been part of the effort on the part of the Allies to halt the German bombing of the UK. And he had been what was called a human computer during World War II. So he and his slide rule sat listening to where the anti-aircraft gunners were saying planes were coming from, the direction and speed, so that he could tell them where to point the gun so that the gun would actually hit the plane. At the end of the war, he returned home to the U.S. and began to notice that his plants were doing exactly what he was calculating his gunners to do in relationship to the sun. And he began to do a little bit of research. He happened to be of German descent, and there was a book out in Germany by a wonderful biologist, Ludwig von Verdelhampfe, who suggested that a plant needed to be understood as a system. And his book was called General System Theory. So Norbert Wiener began to realize that one of the characteristics of any system is that it tends to work towards a goal, and that the goal may be set from the outside, like a thermostat, or it might be set from the inside, like a plant. So he published a book, and a whole lot of people got really interested very quickly. And this was in 1948. And soon after, there were a series of conferences that were sponsored by the Macy family, not Macy's store. They were called the Macy Conferences, and people from all over the world, some of them very well known, Margaret Mead, Gregory Bateson, Kenneth Boulding were among them, and some of them less well known, a man named Ross Ashby, who is a neuropsychiatrist from England in the 40s. These guys would come together, they'd share their ideas for how to apply this concept of goal-directed systems that have information feeding back to some kind of regulator. So if you think about a thermostat, right, you adjust the temperature, that's the goal. The information is sent to the furnace turns on, the temperature goes up. When the temperature gets to the place you've set on the thermostat, the desired goal, then the furnace is turned off. That is the simplest possible feedback loop. You can see it also in your cruise control on your car, right? You set the speed, the car speeds up to that, it wavers around that point for a little bit and tries to hold steady at that point based on the information it's getting from the rotation of the tires on the pavement and the odometer and the speedometer. So a simple feedback loop mechanism is called first-order cybernetics. It's launched a whole field of studies. It became a huge part of the whole space race because, correcting the direction of the rockets was very important. And if you think about it, this is one of my favorite examples. You're riding a boat on the river, and off over there is a dock, right? And so you kind of turn toward the dock, and then you realize, whoops, I've gone a little too far toward the shore. So you kind of turn out to the middle of the river again. Whoops, I've gone too far. And as you get closer to the dock, your turning gets smaller and smaller and smaller until you actually, hopefully, land quite well at the dock. That's the early cybernetic studies, was to see how that worked and create mechanisms that people could use to accomplish their desired goals. As people started applying it, though, they started to realize, but it isn't all that simple. You can't run a complicated system on just one single feedback loop. So in the mid-'70s, a wonderful, wonderful Japanese anthropologist, Magoro Maruyama, suggested that what actually happens are what he called mutual causal deviation amplification loops. For example, in a simple complex system, as the population increases, the amount of trash increases. As the amount of trash increases, the amount of pests living off of and attracted to the trash increases, which then may actually decrease the population. So he started creating these increasing and decreasing feedback loops. The more complex the system you were looking at, the more number of loops there might be. This was used very effectively in the mid-'70s by Jay Forrester from MIT, Donella Meadows from Dartmouth, and others using Fortran and shorthanding Fortran into something called Dynamo, which was built on feedback loops of certain specific variables: energy, population, disease, food supply, resources, and pollution. Those were their primary variables, and as those were increasing and decreasing at different rates, they got different outputs in their projection of what might happen to the world as a whole if these things continued in this way. So the book was The Limits to Growth, and I had the great good fortune to be able to play with the Dynamo model that was the Limits to Growth model. So cybernetics helps us to understand the relationships between the varying variables in any given system. Now, the brain, the body, the mind-brain body are one system. And so a huge part of my work over the years has been to attempt to understand the relationships between those variables and the ways in which they are reinforcing or not reinforcing various behaviors in the mind-body system. So that's cybernetics, and that's why I think it's appropriate for the understanding of consciousness. Well, that's it for today's show. We are out of time for today. But remember, you can continue the exploration on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where there is a list of the titles and other resources we refer to on the show, along with archived past shows, and where you can send me your comments and questions. Thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments at KXCR Community Radio, 90.7 FM, and have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.